So today's workshop, I'm going to minimize this real quick. Today's workshop is on presentation skills. So let me expand on what exactly I mean by presentation skills. I want to kind of break down what it does and doesn't cover. Since we are kind of limited on time here, we won't be able to cover everything. So I just want to be extra clear about what we will be talking about today and what we won't. So we're going to be covering presentation skills and tips. This is things like how to design your slides, how to design your transitions and animations, and how to prepare notes and do general preparation for presenting your PowerPoint or presentation. What it does not cover is the basics of Microsoft PowerPoint. So that's things like how to use the user interface in PowerPoint or basics on how to use PowerPoint. We also will not be covering tips on presenting itself. I'll talk a little bit about presentation, but I won't be talking about presentation itself. Again, that's just because we don't have time to go through all of that material today. If you are interested in those topics, though, you can reach out to me for an additional one-on-one session on any of those topics, or we can also, if there's enough interest from our participants, we can set up a second workshop going over that material as well. So the first thing I want to talk about here is the form of your presentation. So your presentation most of the time is going to be like this presentation you're watching now. It's a Microsoft PowerPoint. It's the most common way that people do professional presentations, but there are other ways that you can do presentations as well, and I just wanted to mention a couple of those. So very popular as well is Visme. Visme is used primarily in corporations. So it's used in a business kind of environment, but it has a little more flexibility than PowerPoint in some things, though it's not as general purpose as PowerPoint. So it can be helpful, and if you're looking to do a professional presentation, it might be worth looking into. Another popular one is Prezi. Prezi is popular amongst students and teachers, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't look as professional, but it does have fancier looking graphics. It's easier to make a nice looking presentation, but it has distracting animations that might be undesirable in a professional setting. Okay. Also, I want to just briefly mention as well, these are all online presentation skills, but our presentation softwares, but you can also do physical presentations like a poster board. And if you were to develop a poster board, a lot of the skills we're going to be talking about throughout this PowerPoint will be helpful for you if you were to develop a poster or some other form of physical presentation, like a physical slideshow. Okay. So the first cardinal rule for any presentation is to keep it simple. Whenever you have a lot of words on the screen, it becomes overwhelming, and the audience will lose your attention. They won't be paying attention to what you're saying, and they'll be just staring at what's on the screen. So when it comes to presentations, we like to say less is more. Here we can see a good and bad example. A PowerPoint slide might look like the one on the left, where you've just got a single statement, and that's a good slide. The important thing to know about a PowerPoint or a presentation in general is the text or images on the screen are there to support your argument, but the majority of the information in the presentation is supposed to come from you speaking vocally. So that's an important thing that a lot of people struggle with when they're making presentations. So here we don't want, for example, here we have a title, then we've got this whole paragraph, then we've got 6 images. That whole slide there could be an entire presentation on its own. So you want to try and avoid having too much information on one slide. Next, going along the same idea of keeping it simple, we want to kind of embrace the idea of bullet points. So you want to enumerate or bullet your points. So enumerate just means list by number 1, 2, 3, or Roman numeral I, and so on. And this helps you to organize your information. When it comes to bullet points, there's also something called the 6x6 rule. It's not a law, so to say, but meaning that it can be broken. But it is a good general rule to follow, and that is that you should have no more than 6 bullets on a single presentation slide, and you should have no more than 6 words per bullet. So you don't want complete sentences, you want ideas or phrases in your bullet points. And then when you speak, you'll speak in complete sentences or ideas. And so bullet points, as opposed to, again, just a paragraph of information, it's going to distract your reader or your viewer, and they're just going to wind up reading your slide instead of listening to the words you're saying. Okay, so this next one, this is a really good example, but the images are a little blurry. Don't worry so much about what the text says. Just know that here they're talking about gender inequality in Japan, and there's a specific quote that's the main point that you want to take away from this slide. So what they've done is they've taken the same slide and they've reduced it down to just that one quote, and then they've reduced it even further to just the number, because they're talking about here 72% of part-time workers in Japan are women. Really, the part you want to emphasize is that 72%. So you can just have the slide be 72%, and then you, as the presenter, will then say the quote aloud. Whenever you have a staggering statistic like that, when it comes to numeric statistics, sometimes it can be more beneficial to actually just put the number on the screen and then explain the context. It's got a more powerful effect on the audience. So the less that you have is generally better. Okay. Next, we want to keep our colors simple. So here we see we've got a white text on a red background. In most of my presentations, for those of you who have seen my presentations in the past, I like a dark gray with a white text, and the reason I do that is because it's easy on the eyes compared to a white background with black text, which is the default. You want to avoid things like here where we have neon colors. So we have neon green, that's a bad thing. We also have contrasting colors. Green and red are opposite on the color spectrum. You want to avoid things like green and red and mixing together, and orange and blue mixing together, because they're on opposite ends of the color spectrum. It creates a lot of contrast, and that can be distracting. As well, you can see on this image on the right that we also have a slight gradient. It might be a little hard for you to see on your end, but it starts off darker, gets brighter in the middle, and gets darker as it goes further away. So you want to avoid gradients as well, again, because they can be distracting and they don't look good. Yeah, so the next thing we want to keep in mind is our font size. So in general, you want to stick to a size 30 font or larger. One exception for that is when you want to de-emphasize something. So when you want to de-emphasize something, a general rule might be to keep your font at size 20. You don't want to go any smaller than that, because then it's going to be illegible. You won't be able to read it. The only time you might go smaller is if you're, for example, if you're using a quotation and you want to note which source it is for the end of the presentation for your sources. A general rule for the body of your text is to keep it at a size 32, which is this size here. And then for your title, like the font size at the top here, that is a size 44. And finally, for text that you want to take up the full slide, you want to use size 72 or larger. Next, I want to mention that you want to use sans serif font. So sans serif font, what does that mean? Well, it's easier to define sans serif in terms of serif. So a serif font is a font that has little wings on the edges of curves on a text. So a common text font that you might know is Times New Roman. Times New Roman is a serif font because it has those little wings on each of the joints of the text. A sans serif font goes without. Sans is French for without, so that's where that comes from. So it's without the serifs. Okay. Common examples of sans serif text, and these are fonts that you would use in your presentation, would be things like Calibri, Helvetica, Tahoma, and Verdana. Now you may be asking, why does it matter? Well, sans serif fonts tend to be easier to read when it comes to large text for presentations. It allows the reader to, or the viewer to quickly move on from the information. You don't spend too much time renumerating, thinking about the text you're seeing on the screen. Whereas serif fonts are desirable within books or papers, things with small text, and it helps as well with sometimes with people who have dyslexia. So it kind of helps you to slow down and think about the words you're reading. So there's an advantage to each type of font, but we want to use sans serif for our presentations. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to avoid overstyling. So what that means is here we have in just 3 words, we've underlined avoid. We've also changed the font color on that underline to red. So that's 2 things. Then we've got over is italicized and styling is bolded. That's way too much stylization. It's okay to have some stylization in your presentation, but you want to avoid overdoing it. Next, you want to take advantage of a reading layout. So what that means is when you read a book, for Western audiences, when you read a book, you read from left to right and top to bottom. So you want to take advantage of that in your presentation. That's the kind of natural direction that your eyes will follow when you look at information. So here, for example, if we have the title in the top left, and then we have the body below that, and then we have images to the right of it, what that says is we'll start with the title, go to the text, then move to the images. If you had the images on the left, or if you had the headline in a different spot, you might start in a different order, which would be undesirable. So here's an example. We have the headline is at the bottom, so and the images are on the left. So the first thing you see is the images. Maybe you never even look at the text, you just stare at the pictures the whole time. So you want to avoid doing stuff like that. It's generally better to have the images on the right side if you can, or at the bottom of the slide. Now, that's one way. This is one way of organizing your slides, but there are other ways as well. One of the most common ways to organize your slides is called the rule of thirds, and that is if you were to take a slide and split it into 3 columns vertically and horizontally, you want to try to draw your attention, or the reader's attention, generally to the center of the screen. That's where you'll be able to hold their attention most easily. So if there's a really important point that you want to emphasize, it's better if you can put it in the center of the screen. That way the reader will be drawn, or the viewer will be drawn to it. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is title position. So here we can see on this slide, title positioning is centered at the top of the slide. Now this is good when you've got a lot of images and you're showing images. You want to it's a presentation styling thing that's more about the way that it looks than anything else, but it looks better if you've got images on both sides like we're about to have here. So here we have another title. This is one from earlier when I talked about what we're covering and not covering today. You'll see that we have no title. Instead, we've got 2 columns. So it's okay, sometimes your slides don't need to have titles, and that's an important distinction. But in this case, we can go ahead and treat these columns as our 2 titles, as column headers, and you can see that they're aligned to the left, so they're not centered above the text.
You know there were 7 debates on the stage. 7 debates. 7 different parts of Illinois.
I'm sorry, I've got somebody talking right now.
I'm going to decide we go first 4 times,
let's see.
and then therefore have the last 30 minutes.
Go ahead and mute. I think that was okay. I think I've got that. Sorry about that. Somebody just didn't have their mic muted. I guess I had TV on in the background. Okay. So the next thing here is, I click back in here now. Here we have, this is an example from one of my previous presentations on writing skills. So here, when we have a lot of information on the screen, we also align the text or the title to the left. Here, this is a presentation I did when I was doing my own schooling. This was on the anatomy of the human brain. Now, in this case, the title is at the bottom, and that's because the images are the thing that I want to emphasize. I was going through each of these different pictures and talking about each one individually in detail before, so the title here was not as important. Whereas from the same presentation here, I have I'm quoting a paper, and so I wanted to include the entire title of the paper with the authors, and you can see here I've got that centered at the top. And what I've done as well, since it's a lot of text, but it's important that I emphasize that information, is I've added a black or darker background behind it to kind of emphasize the title. You can do that as well if, for example, if my two left slides here had a lighter background, I could, for example, put a dark background behind just the title. And that's a nice little tweak you can do to your presentations to make your titles stand out. And it's not just titles, you can also make information in general in your body stand out doing that same kind of technique. Alright, so next we want to focus on image selection. Now this is oftentimes with the presentation, especially depending on how long you have to work on a presentation, the most important part of your presentation. So when you work on a presentation, you can find an initial set of pictures, but then you decide later on you want to replace your pictures, and you'll keep doing this. And there is no such thing as a perfect presentation. There's always a better image to be found. There's always a more succinct way to make a statement. So keeping that in mind, we're going to look at some ways that we can improve the images in your presentations. So one of those ways is to find images that are relatable. What do I mean by relatable? Well, first off, they need to reach the audience, the intended audience. Secondly, they need to be obviously related to the topic that you're talking about. So here I've selected this image. This is a program for veterans participants. So this would be relatable for our veterans. But as well, people in general like to see images of happy people, or just people in general. Seeing an image with a person in it versus an image with just a landscape background, an image with a person is naturally just more relatable to us as humans, as social creatures. As well, here we've got an image. We've got a student who's struggling. They're taking a test maybe. And for a lot of you who are students or who are looking to become students, this is a relatable image. So these are that's what I mean when I say relatable. You want to find your audience, and then you want to kind of find an image that represents their interest in the topic that you're discussing. Next, we want to try and find some images that can be inspirational. So our first example here, we have an image of an airplane flying over some palm trees. So this can be evocative of maybe travel or taking a vacation, long-term goals that you inspire to work towards. Like one day I'm going to go on that vacation to the Bahamas or something like that. Another thing here we've got is a silhouetted person looking out to the stars. When we think of the stars, it's kind of an experience that helps to broaden our horizons, to look beyond at the vastness of existence, and that's a really inspirational thing for some people. So when you want to create whenever you want to create a presentation that really reaches the audience, you can use an inspirational image like this. And as well, again, going back to a relatable image, here we have a group of students who are graduating. And for those of you who are going through school right now, that's a long-term goal, something you want to work towards. And it kind of evokes this inspirational feeling. So Using any one of these, even if it wasn't necessarily related to your topic, and that's the thing with inspirational images, they don't necessarily have to be related to your topic, you can create an emotion or a feeling. So sometimes your images aren't meant to be related to the topic, but to evoke an emotion or a feeling. The next thing here is to talk about white space. So white space is blank space or space that is neutral within your image that you can perhaps place text upon. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly white, but here our first example is kind of funny. We've got here planking. So we've got a businessman here, just worn out, tired from his day, but somebody thought, hey, that's funny. We'll make a presentation about planking. And maybe this is your title slide for a presentation on planking. Here we have another one. So here, as I said before, your white space doesn't have to be white, but here in this example, we have a thought bubble. And that thought bubble, we could put our own text in, and we can make that fit for whatever we want. So that's a really powerful thing, is if you can find images like these that allow you to kind of create your own ideas based on the white space. So here we have an example for collaboration. Now, collaboration is one of the most common themes you'll see in a slideshow or a presentation. And one of the most common images that you'll see in any kind of presentation about collaboration is going to be the boardroom meeting. Now, the boardroom meeting is not bad. This is a good stock image. It's actually a very good image about collaboration, but it's standard and you see it all the time. So we can try and be a little more creative with this. Again, this isn't bad, but we're just looking at how we can improve. So another thing here we could do is we've got this is a really nice graphic. It's not cheesy like clip art. Again, I didn't mention this before, but clip art, you want to try and avoid clip art in your presentations. Clip art comes across as unprofessional because it's not very clean edges, and it's often low resolution. It's not the highest quality, so we want to avoid clip art. But this is a good graphic. It's clean, nice colors, no bad shading. It is a little low resolution, but it's I've got the images small, so it's not blown up and emphasizing that low resolution. So that's a good image we could use for collaboration. But here, this one, I really like this one. This one's good. So here we've got 5 figures silhouetted walking together. Now, this is kind of a different kind of collaboration. This kind of gives a sense of people out against the world working together. They're going against the machine kind of thing. Like you really get this sense of these 5 people are working together against the odds, and I think that's a more powerful message maybe than a frankly generic image of people in a boardroom that you've probably seen several times before. And again, it's not a bad image, it's a well taken photo, but if you've seen it so many times before, it's not going to catch your viewers' attention. Now the next thing I want to talk about is mood boards. So I briefly talked about colors and trying to avoid contrasting colors because it's distracting. So now we're going to talk about mood boards. A mood board is where you set a theme for your presentation. So this would be something you do before you start your presentation. You would select a couple of fonts that you like. So here they've selected Impact, which is their sans serif font. It's big and bold. It really emphasizes the text. And then Georgia. Here we're using, you can see that Georgia here is a serif font. Now Georgia here you could use for things like quotations, or if you want to emphasize certain points. Again, as I mentioned before, with these serif fonts, they can draw your attention or be distracting. So maybe if you have a quotation that takes up the full screen, you might use the Georgia font in that case. As well, here you can see they're using colors, and these colors are warmer colors, which means they're a little washed out looking. Hold on just one second. so they're a little washed out looking, and that can give a certain theme. Now here you can see we've got a couple of different images. These aren't necessarily related to the presentation itself. It could have nothing to do with the topic of the presentation, but these kind of give you a theme for the types of images you want to go for. So this is kind of an Art Deco modernism style. Now here we have another example here. They're using two very similar fonts. They're using Gill Sans, and they're using two different variations on Gill Sans. They're using Gill Sans Semi-Bold Italic and Gill Sans Light. Now this is another powerful thing you can do, is if you can find fonts that are similar but different, you can kind of emphasize different things in different ways. So maybe you want to use one font type for your titles, whereas you use a different font type for the body of your presentation. And then again here we've got different images that are supposed to evoke kind of the theme or for the pictures you want to choose. You've got a lot of rounded edges. You've got a lot of contrast between the colors. So these are kind of things that you can do when you're preparing your presentation before you start selecting your images to kind of get a theme to make your presentation kind of click together, make it seem cohesive. Alright, next we want to talk about animations. Now there are good animations and bad animations, but most of the time animations are bad. We'll start off by talking about some of the good animations. So the first one here, you'll see this image simply appeared. It appeared, and I can make it disappear. And that's a good animation. It's not distracting, and that's what we want from animations, is to not be distracting. Here we have an image that fades in and fades out. Again, that's a good one. And here we have with text, we can do a couple of things. We can underline it. That's good. We can fill the text with a different color, so we change from white to red. It fills from left to right. We can also fade from red to green. That's also good, not too distracting. But then we have things like this. So this one wasn't too bad. It's not terrible, but you've got an image sliding out. Now, if there were other things on this side of the screen, on the right side of the screen, and you were looking at one of those things and then this image comes sliding up, that would be distracting. So that's why this is bad. In this particular case, because there's nothing really else going on, it's not so bad. But if you have a busy slide and you use something like that, it's pretty distracting. We also have here, this is a bad exit transition. You've got kind of this random bars like disappearing. It draws too much attention, so you want to try and avoid things like that. This is a classic one here, where you've got the image spinning into frame. That is very distracting. Definitely want to avoid that one. And then bouncing away, that is one of the worst animations you can use. Definitely try and avoid that one. Then here we have the text just spins in, and then it kind of does the worm here. These are things you want to avoid. These are fine for like fun presentations, but when you're doing a professional presentation, things you definitely want to avoid. Next, we want to talk about transitions. So transitions, that is kind of similar to an animation, and it happens between slides. The general rule with transitions is that almost all transitions are bad. You want to try and avoid transitions almost all the time, but some transitions can be good. We'll talk about them. I say good, but they're really okay. They're very situational, even the ones that are good. So here we can see we transition from these two slides. There's no transition. It's just it switches to the slide. Whereas here we have our first transition, and this is an okay one, where we just fade in, or fade out and fade in. So that's okay. It works in this case because the two images, as you can see, they're taking up the same amount of space, and the titles are in the same location, so it doesn't distract too much. Another really common one is the crossfade. So here we can see, again, the titles are the same, so that works well. The images take up the same amount of space. You see this a lot of time in video editing. If you can do a fast crossfade, it can actually look better than just a normal transition. But the weakness with crossfades is whenever you transition from something where you have the images in the same place to something where the images are in different places, the titles are in different places. So this is still okay, but this is a lot more distracting than this transition. So this one is something you kind of want to avoid, but it's still on that border of being okay. Next, we have a bad one. So this is kind of like those vertical bar or horizontal bars from before. This one's just a little bit too distracting, and this next one is a light flash. So that's very distracting. It's like a camera flash. You definitely want to avoid ones like that, and it can get even worse. You've got stuff like this, where you've got a spinning cube. You get all kinds of animations like that, like a paper peeling away. You definitely want to avoid those. Just stick to something simple for professional presentations. Okay, next one we'll talk about preparing your presentation notes. So you want to prepare notes based on the format of your presentation. For a live presentation, you typically want to use note cards, whereas for a PowerPoint, you can use, and if you have like two screens, you've got a computer screen and then you've got your presentation screen, then you can use just the notes on PowerPoint. Now, you also want to make sure you limit your notes. If you don't limit your notes, you run into a problem where maybe you freeze and forget what you're supposed to say, or you start reading off of the note cards and not paying attention to the audience, and that can be a problem. So you want to limit your notes to things like key phrases, important things that you want to say. You don't want entire sentences. You don't want a list of all of the notes of everything you want to talk about. If you miss something, your audience probably won't know. You'll be the only one that knows that you've missed something. So don't worry if you miss something. You can always come back and talk about it later whenever people have questions. Next, we want to look at things like prompts to yourself, like look up, look at the audience, slow down or speed up. And then also difficult words or names, maybe dates as well if you're doing like a historical presentation. And let's look at a couple of good and bad ideas here with presentation notes. So here, this is kind of it. You want to highlight the important text. You want to maximize the value. You don't want to highlight everything. So what I mean by that, this is kind of a taking a step back, broader kind of way to look at it. You want to have very few things written on your note cards or in your slideshow notes. You don't want to have an entire book written in it, because then when you go to read your notes and you forget something, you're going to have to go through all of those notes to find that thing that matters. Also, you want to give, again, things like prompts, things to remind yourself, stay on topic, slow down, go faster, things like that. And you want to avoid, again, having way too many notes on your presentation note cards. All right. Now, the final thing is you want to rehearse. Now, one of the most common mistakes I see with presentations when you're rehearsing is people think they need to wait until the end and then rehearse. It's when in fact it's better to practice slides as you write them. Now, this helps you kind of to create a draft and to figure out what does and doesn't work. As well, you want to time yourself at least once. That way you can kind of get in the right range for your presentation length. And then finally, you want to make sure you rehearse with the same technology you'll be using during the presentation. Alright, so that's all I had, and I went a little longer this time than in the morning one, so we don't have much time for questions. I'm going to very quickly tell you about next week's workshop. We're having, not next week's, but the next workshop, we're going to have 2 guest speakers. I believe, Veronica, if you're here, if you could talk about that just real quick.
Yeah, next week, not next week, but on the 22nd, we'll be having 2 guest speakers, and because of the type of workshop it is as far as the speakers, we can only have it one time during the day. So it will be at the 9 o'clock. This one we will not be able to do 2 of them like we normally do, but we will be sending out the normal information and reminders about the workshop. But it's going to be a lot of information, and they're going to give a lot of information on veterans resources.